If you're watching this on launch, just a quick reminder that our My Mini Factory store has less than a day left where it is 30% off. Just use the code TTT30 off to get 30% off all our minis on our My Mini Factory store, including our awesome new minis such as Scrap for Gatecrash, which I'm painting in this video. It's tabletop time, I'm Dave, and today I'm gonna do something a little different, and that's take everyone on a really deep painting journey of how I painted my very first box art. It's basically the thumbnails of miniatures. This is what draws you to a model, and it's basically an advertisement trying to get you to pick it up, take a look, and maybe even buy it. So that means by nature, box art is typically a high quality paint job done by professional artists to showcase a miniature in its absolute best form. And I'll be painting Scrap, but I won't be talking too much about Gatecrash in this video. Instead, I'll be focusing on the journey of painting my first ever, nervously titled professional quality paint job. So to start with, for Scrap, we needed a model to paint. So we 3D printed a copy of Scrap at the highest possible settings. And I cleaned that up very carefully, and I was pretty happy with the results. There weren't any obvious layer lines, and altogether, it was a very clean print and a really nice basis to work off. I primed the model black, as my preferred method of painting ensures that all the recessed areas are covered in some nice shading. I knew I wanted the model to have earthy tones throughout, so I did a quick zenithal of a brown just to cover everything in a nice dulled back earthy tone. When I paint miniatures to a high standard, I usually paint with the getting dressed method of painting models. So basically what you do is you paint the innermost areas first, such as the skin, and then you progressively move outwards, painting their underclothes, then their middle layers, outer layers, then bags, accessories, belts, etc. It is a lot easier to paint a detail on the outside of a model than it is to paint a recess without spilling paint over. So even though I wanted Scrap to have quite a light Caucasian skin tone as to match his concept art, I actually came in with quite a deep tan to establish the foundational skin tones. For the inside of the mouth, I painted it a deeper purpley pink and also a lighter pink for the tongue. Scrap also has these lovely teeth with a big gap in them, so I used a bone white color to just lay down a foundational base coat on them, and this was an area where I applied a wash. In these specific recessed areas where you can really contain and control the wash and you're looking to add depth and a bit of darkness, these can help to just add a gradient through your base coat. Then I grabbed dwarven flesh with quite a bit of yellow in it and then mixed up to a pale flesh, painting the skin in several gradient layers and feathering out the blend in areas. Ultimately, I would come back to the skin and continue touching it up, as this is an area I'm probably the least confident with and is something that's the easiest to get wrong, I think, on minis. Now with Scrap being 40mm scale and with these lovely detailed eyes, it was super easy for me to get in and paint them. When painting eyes like this, I'm never concerned about the whites going too far out because I always bring them back in. So I just painted some white and I painted a bright blue for his irises. Now his maddening bugged out expression obviously looked a bit wild, so this is where I also use a little bit more wash. A crimson wash just very delicately applied around the outside of the eye can really add to the effect of the eyelids and blend them in nicely. Allowing that to dry, I moved on to other parts of the face, going through several of those blends and bringing up to highlights. Although his crazy left eye I'll be coming back to later once the wash is dried. Another feature on Scrap's face is his little band-aid on his cheek. I wasn't entirely sure what to paint this as. Initially I was thinking of doing a little bit of a cartoon design on it. Eventually I just decided on a generic plaster. Oh yes, band-aid is what Australians call plasters. I think that's what you call them in other countries? I don't know. Then moving on to Scrap's hair, I base coated it in Vallejo's earth and then moved up to a desert yellow paint. The box art colors of Scrap are of course to have this lovely sandy blonde hair, and these obvious tufts at the front are super easy to just highlight up with a nice rough feathered effect all the way up to a bright yellow and then an off white. With that done, Scrap's skin and face are looking pretty good for now, although I do plan on coming back to them at the end to kind of just bring everything up and make sure the whole model is feeling nice and balanced. So I've definitely got to say it's been an exciting but daunting task, and I want to encourage everyone out there who's gone through the same thing to just try. I've really enjoyed pushing myself as I'm starting to go through the journey of painting Scrap, and while I have painted models to a similar paint quality before, I always try and find something new or a new area to push myself or a new
learning I can take from other painters and take into my next paint job. And something that was definitely distinct about this journey is how painting for a miniature box art means you are painting to showcase not only the character but also the lore and the faction, which means you have to think a lot about your color choices. While I had concept art to go from and work from that would guide me, the decisions I make in this paint job will ultimately lead to how lots of other people end up painting their scrap. So it's actually a pretty big responsibility to be the one that's establishing this paint scheme. And while a huge swathe of mini painters don't care about that and paint however they like, a lot of people do. And I don't think it's fair to pretend that they don't exist.
Now, scrap is from the faction in the game called Corpus, and Corpus often uses browns, reds, oranges, and yellows in their paint scheme. So we wanted to reflect that in Scrap's coloration. So following off from the prompts of the box art, I painted his singlet or tank top in a deep red. And while that was drying, I moved on up to his lovely scarf and gave that a vibrant hot orange, which would go on to take many, many coats as this paint was very thin and didn't have particularly great pigment coverage. On the art, his shorts are a little bit hard to see, so I felt like I had a little bit of liberty here. I painted some areas that I was happy for them to just sort of fall away into the model and not draw too much attention in a charcoal black base coat. Once that was done, I moved on to base coating the bandage on his arm. Now, while I do prefer to paint entire areas of the model to near completion one at a time, I had to match my tones pretty carefully to try and make sure the model didn't have areas that were competing for your attention. So to do this, I just wanted to establish these base tones nice and early. We like the idea of Scrap's helmet being one of the few parts of his model that really captures the sci-fi world that he came from. So we'd chosen to do a white. And as with all whites, I started from a foundational color that I'd be building up from. And in this case, it was Vallejo's Somber Blue. For his boots and leather straps, I went with Charred Brown, my preferred dark brown from the game color range. With a lot of these foundational colors in, I moved on to the helmet and started blending up a series of whites, going with somber gray mixes and ghost gray all the way up to a point highlight of white. However, I was definitely not happy with the transitions here. So ultimately this effort will be scrapped, and I'm going to come back to this later and fix it up. The visor on Scrap's helmet is a lovely glossy gold, and it reminds me a little bit of astronauts' helmets and the gold coating within them. It's quite similar to painting non-metallic metal, picking out areas or gradients in a darker tone and a brighter tone, and then doing glazes and blends in succession with mixes of those colors to make a clean gradient between the two. This process ends up creating a massive amount of contrast, which is a really good way of tricking the eye into thinking that the surface is reflective. So oftentimes something that's really good to do when taking a lot of time to paint these miniatures is to step away from them and have a little break. So I had set Scrap down for the night and came back to tackle this again and immediately went straight back to that helmet. So I got a very light glaze of the ghost gray and I went over the entire helmet, glazing through all of those darker recessed areas and basically bringing the entire brightness of the helmet way up. I then moved to more pronounced highlights and brought it much closer to white in the end. I was much happier with the finished result. And it really shows how sleeping on something and coming back to it can be a huge advantage to getting your paint job to where you want it to be. So for the three main fabric areas on Scrap, I mixed increasingly bright versions of the original colors, bringing the red up to quite a vibrant crimson, the orange up to almost a hot yellow, and the shorts I highlighted up to a mid gray. And for all of these fabric elements, I used a quite watered down, almost glaze-like consistency for my highlights. And rather than doing solid lines, I almost stippled or feathered with the very tip of my brush to give a little bit of a rough effect when laying down the paint. Personally, I really like giving this scratchy look to fabrics, especially worn and weathered ones, as it helps to give them a little bit of texture in the paint job and helps to make them distinct from different textures on the model. I used the same technique to put a highlight on all of the leather straps, being very careful as these tiny details are easy to mess up, and I wanted these highlights to be kind of subtle. Once this was done, I actually came back with a mix of black and the original charred brown and pushed it into some of the recesses on the boots to increase the contrast between the worn areas and altogether just get a nicer gradient through the leather of the shoes. I love the idea that Scrap has bright orange corpus-colored shoelaces. Mostly because I can just see a kid putting in bright orange shoelaces in their boots. It's a little touch that you wouldn't see on most militarized or adult characters with their stompy war boots. I thought it was fun painting a kid in the apocalypse to be able to add a little bit of personal flair in a surprising way.
I mentioned our My Mini Factory store is having sale. It's 30% off using the code TTT30 off, and it will be up for less than 1 day after you see this video. So if you're interested in supporting the development of our game Gatecrash, check out the minis for Scrap and Hypatia that are up on our My Mini Factory right now, and that code will already get you 30% off because it applies to our whole store. So if you've been holding out on getting Space Bears bits, vehicle parts, busts, or even the Apocalypse Ghost mini, or you're looking forward to painting Scrap yourself and maybe even following along with how I painted mine, we'd super appreciate it if you could head on over to our My Mini Factory, links in the description, and check them out. 100% of the proceeds made from every single sale of miniatures for Gatecrash goes directly towards developing more concept art and hiring more sculptors to make more characters. So if you're liking these models and their themes and you want to see more of them, picking up these models is an amazing way to support the development of more of them. And that's enough of an interruption. Let's get back to painting the Scrap. That will soon appear on Scrap's My Mini Factory page.
So I'd been making pretty good progress with Scrap, but I wanted to start to establish even more of those different textures on the model. So that meant moving into metallics. I picked out all the buckles and areas like the blades in a mid-gray, so I would ultimately be going on to paint them non-metallic metal. I also took this opportunity to highlight the bandages on Scrap's arm, just using a bone white and feathering along the edges of each of the wrappings. Then, using the two halves of his blade, I came in with a traditional power sword style non-metallic metal. This is where you do a checkered pattern alternating between bright and dark areas, and then you blend and create a gradient between the colors. Then, using one of the highlight colors, you pick along all of the raised surfaces and do some little scratchy marks across the non-metallic metal to make it look like a worn and weathered steel sword. This method of painting non-metallic metal blades really comes together when you paint those crisp highlights along the edges and then all the point highlights in white towards the tips and any areas that you want to grab particular attention. And I hated it. So I grabbed Murray along and asked for a little bit of advice, talking about why I wasn't happy with where it was and what I wanted to change. Ultimately, the non-metallic metal just felt a little bit like I was being lazy. It's a technique I've used before on multiple things, and honestly, it's a little bit easy for me to just lean back into the same old colors and the same old gradient and the same old pattern. It just didn't quite fit, and I knew I had to adjust. The first idea we had was to try and tint the blade to make it look more in line with Corpus. So I put a glaze across it and immediately hated it even more. Knowing that I doomed my paint job and all the effort I'd already done, I quickly wicked off that with some water. So I tried a different glaze. What about orange? Surely that would look good. No, it's awful. Get it off, get it off, get it off. And in a fit of indecision and finality, I just painted over the whole thing. I was done. I was changing the tone. I was changing the tune. It was time to start from scratch. So I completely changed my idea around this, and instead of going for a non-metallic metal, crisp, shiny looking sword, I decided instead to make it a quite blunt, non-reflective, and rusty looking blade. This would allow me to continue to incorporate the weathered browns and oranges of Corpus, while also not creating yet another incredibly distracting point highlight on the model. The broken blade in his hand is definitely a secondary weapon, so I wanted to draw secondary attention. Now it was time to move on to Scrap's giant fist. So I primed the fist itself black and the other components in a dark gray, and then set about establishing a yellow hazard stripe pattern across the fist to make it a real focal point of the model. This bold pattern continues the theme of yellows, oranges, and reds on the model, but is also quite striking, and from above will draw the attention pretty rapidly. For all the steel components of Scrap's fist, such as the joints between the robotic fingers, I painted them in a light gray. And then I used another wash. This one was Nuln Oil Gloss, and I used this because I wanted the slight gloss element in the wash to look like oily mechanical hydraulics. Once this had dry, I came in and very carefully applied a whole bunch of line and point highlights, gently dabbing in color and mixing in brighter grays with whites so I could get some really nice metal reflections going on those hydraulic knuckles. For the body or the mount of Scrap's Gauntlet, I decided it should look like it was from a completely different metal component. component. So over the top of that charcoal grey I had already done, I extremely carefully, roughly stippled on red paint. This was a deliberate attempt to get a weathered and chipped paint effect. Now at this stage, most of Scrap himself was painted, so it was time to come in and really make areas pop. The first thing was that red mottled gauntlet that I'd been painting. I really wasn't happy with how that was blending in and just sitting against his torso. So I grabbed a brighter red than I'd used anywhere else, and once again, using that stippling technique, just added some really fine highlights. As well as that, I grabbed a bright grey and did the same thing again, not being afraid to mix these areas just slightly, so it looked like the steel beneath the red paint was starting to chip and show through. I wanted to come back to Scrap's face and just put a little bit more work into that skin. I came in with Elfic Flesh Tone, one of the brightest flesh tones from Vallejo's game color, and painted some highlight areas, especially the nose, cheek, and just the tip of his chin. Then it was time to make Scrap's weathered bone-looking teeth a little bit healthier. So I came in with a off-white and just did a tiny dot on the tip of each of his teeth to help define them individually. Continuing this trend, I grabbed brighter whites and came back in on all the metal areas, including the visor, and just gave little point highlights on all the areas I thought deserved a bit of attention. I was also not happy with the yellow hazard stripes, they just lacked a bit of depth, so I grabbed an orange wash and just tinted the recessed areas of the hazard stripes where they met other objects.
Alright, so I'm really curious where you all sit on this. I've always wondered what was more effective for games like Warhammer 40k. They seem to swing back and forth between using really cool concept art to advertise their box games and using just solid images of the painted model. And previously we've seen models and photos taken in environments to then going to isolated models on a gradient or a simple patterned box. And now we've seen it come all the way back again. And we're back at seeing minis in sort of themed but faded out a little bit and subtle backdrops that reflect their environment with a color palette of their faction incorporated as well. So as we are actually developing box art, it would be amazing to hear from all of you what you like to see. Let us know in the comments. Do you prefer the style of official artwork only on your box art? Do you prefer a fully painted example of the miniature isolated in that box art? Or like Games Workshop's recent swing, would you prefer those painted minis on a bit of a setting or backdrop with maybe a color gradient that identifies the faction they're from? This kind of feedback that you can give us will directly go on to shape the decisions we make with Gatecrash. So I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on what you love the most in box art. What makes it iconic, what makes it interesting, and what makes you want to pick up a box? All right, musing thought aside, back to painting.
So with Scrap in a place I was happy with, it was time to do his base. And the best way to picture Scrap's world is if Aperture Science from Portal had been, well, blown up and had covered an entire planet. Most of the scrap on Scrap's base is metal in origin, so I just picked out a few fundamental base coats. A grey, a dark brown, a mid-orangey brown, and a blue-grey. These would all be painted in much the same way, using blends of brighter colours into the highlights and also darker colours into the recesses in a fairly standard non-metallic metal. With a lot of these base coats down though, there were areas on the base where his sculpted elements ended and the black base began. So I used a Citadel technical paint just to trim in these edges and make the whole model seamlessly part of the one base. I will say one of the areas I'm particularly proud of is a recipe I came up with myself. Using Vallejo's charred brown as well as some scale 75 paints, I found a way to paint this really dark, dirty, brassy color. It highlights up to a sandy yellow and goes back to a mix of black and charred brown, but by feathering this on in gradients, I absolutely love this look for these dark, weathered industrial components. I use it on my Horus Heresy Alpha Legion for a lot of the more mechanical or mechanicum aligned elements, and once it's got that final highlight and the black line, I really like the way it looks. And to continue to differentiate all the different metals on the base, I decided that there are a few bits of rebar that I wanted to bring up into the terracotta and tan tones and then highlight with a little bit of a heavy orange. This once again just continues the theme of scrap and corpus and those orangey red colors down into the base as well. And as a final step on the base, to make it look a little bit more lived in and natural, it was time to add a few different tones into the weathering. I used pigment powders here, and I used a green pigment powder, a reddy orange pigment powder, and then a charcoal black pigment powder. Mixing these three and dabbing them on in different areas just gives the effect of maybe some moss overgrowth or paint oversplash or rust and dirt. Overall, these different tones blended together just makes the whole scene come together nicely and feel a lot more natural. So with the final step of a nice bit of black paint around the rim, it's time to take a look at, well, my first ever box art model.
So as we enjoy scrap slowly rotating, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our lovely patrons at Tabletop Time. It is only with your support that we are able to tackle 2 videos every week and to continue diving into the world of miniatures that we are so passionate about. If you've been enjoying our content and would love to support us further, consider joining our Patreon. We have an exclusive mini club Discord, weekly Patreon videos, including behind the scenes updates on Gatecrash, and our ever popular monthly mini review. Look forward to seeing you there. Here he is. I don't really want to touch him anymore. I've spent a fair bit of time on this paint job, and painting a tiny mini, even at 40mm scale like a kid, was really finicky, and resin 3D prints, very brittle. So let's just leave our box art scrap off to one side and hopefully not break him. I hope you've all enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for joining me for more of a paint tutorial-y video. We don't usually do these, so it's been a joy painting it. I certainly learned some things along the journey, and I hope it can be a stepping stone to becoming a better painter, but also showcase that you don't need to be the best in the world to make some pretty cool box art. With that said, I'm done here. Tune in later in the week for our second video of the week, where we're tackling something a little more 40K related. All right, everyone, bye. Oh, scrap stuck in my hair. Legitimately. What the f***? I have a tiny man in my hair telling me to do dark things. Okay, sorry.